Right, we are recording, so welcome everyone to our weekly DNS call, sponsored as always by DNS OARC, so many thanks to the OARC organisation for that. This week, as you can see, and if I just move my slide on to show you the agenda, in a moment I'll hand over to Sara Dickinson from Sinodun, who is going to talk a little bit about authoritative DNS over TLS and DNS over QUIC deployment initiative. Sorry, the authoritative DoT and ADoQ deployment initiative. And then, as always, go through some recent developments. Just call out some impending deadlines, etc. Just for context, the reason why we're doing authoritative DoT and ADoQ is Sara hosted a really interesting side meeting. Sorry, just switch off my screen share. Hosted a really interesting side meeting in Madrid all of, 2 months ago. It seems like a long time ago, just a couple of months or so ago, on the same topic, and a lot of people turned up. And from my recollection, a lot of people were doing stuff in this space, even though the concept seemed to sort of stop through lack of any enthusiasm during the I think it was it Deprive, I think, working group. This was a concept, but it didn't seem to gather any momentum there for whatever reason, probably plenty of good reasons. But it turns out there's lots of really interesting initiatives, a whole bunch of people doing stuff under their own steam. So I think the discussion in Madrid sort of just drew that to people's attention, and I'm hoping that since there's a bit more coordination of that and more momentum building. But Sara's going to talk about that, and also I think that it's going to be discussed as well at OARC in Stockholm next week, in a week or so, which is fantastic. So even more opportunity to talk about it. So with that in mind, let me stop talking, hand over to Sara, and I'm really interested to see how things have evolved over the last, 2.5 months since the really great discussion in Madrid. So Sara, thanks for joining. Over to you.
Let me try and share my screen and hope that that sheep video wasn't too long and everybody has actually finished watching it and is paying attention again. But I can't really compete with it otherwise. All right, so hopefully you can see my slides now.
Yep, all clear.
Okay, great. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to chat a bit about the ADoT, ADoQ deployment initiative. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to follow up and talk today, Andrew. I'm going to start with a little bit of history about the encryption of DNS to put this in a bit of context. On this slide, I'm trying to show a timeline, and above the middle line here is an overview of what's happened in terms of stub to recursive specification and deployment. And most of this early work was done in Deprive. It's now over 10 years since we started talking about encrypted DNS. And at the time, one of the taglines was, well, DNS is over 30 years old and we haven't encrypted it yet. 10 years later, DNS is over 40 years old, and we now have 10 years working trying to encrypt it. Bulk of the work was done on specifying DOT and DOH between 2016 and 2018. And what we were doing there was really just specifying the transport side of things for stub to recursive specifically at that time, because that's all that Deprive was chartered to do. And once they were complete in 2018, the work switched focus for stub to recursive, and the ADD working group span up, and they did all the hard work around figuring out how a stub in a particular network can discover the encrypted resolvers that it can use and can bootstrap its way up to doing encrypted connections. And that's, although it was a complicated problem, it's relatively constrained because it's a per network, per stub problem. You find one recursive and then bootstrap to that. At the same time, Deprive itself pivoted and was rechartered to try to start looking at the problem of doing recursive to authoritative, which is much harder because unlike the stub to recursive case, where you even have the option to hard code something into your device or to rely on discovery within the network, when you're doing recursive to authoritative, you need to get hold of a credential for an authoritative that you can use to authenticate the TLS connection. So this could be a name or it could be a key. I'm just going to talk about credentials in general. And of course, what you need to do as a recursive is effectively get that on demand as you talk to every authoritative that you need to service the client queries that you get. So rather than this being a sort of one-to-one problem in the stub to recursive case, this is a one-to-many problem. And you're also trying to do this entirely inbound within the DNS. So after the rechartering, what effectively happened was 3 years of collective wheel spinning, navel gazing and bike shedding, as only the IETF can do. And what happened was there were multiple solutions put forward. They generally fall into 6 camps, and I'll talk about those more in a minute. There were about a dozen drafts. There was some interesting stuff. There were some hacks. There were some almost rans. But ultimately, this became an epic fail because we could not get consensus within the working group on what the right solution to move forward was if you want to do this strict model that requires you to obtain a credential securely within the DNS. So it wasn't a lack of enthusiasm, it was actually technical blockers that stopped this moving forward in 2021. And that's about when the last messages on this came to the working group, and the effort kind of petered out because we had nowhere to go technically at the time. In parallel to those efforts, we were also standardising DNS over QUIC, which was published in 2022. And I'll just mention that that was published as a general purpose transport. So whereas DOT and DOH at the time were just designed to work stub to recursive, by the time DOQ came along, it was specified to be stub to recursive, recursive to authoritative, zone transfer. It could be used for anything. So after that, there was one thing that the working group worked on before it shut down earlier this year, and that was RC 9549, which has a title which is the unilateral opportunistic probing for recursive to authoritative. And basically, this was a best effort work to say, even if we can't do strict because we don't have a technical solution, what can we do to enable this to move forward? And it was a relatively straightforward draft that proposed that a recursive could probe an authoritative on port 853. And if it got an answer, it would record that that authoritative was providing an encrypted transport. It would switch to that transport and keep using it as long as it kept getting answers. If it didn't get an answer on 853, it would back off and retry at a suitable time interval. So this isn't ideal because you're not authenticating the TLS connection. It can be downgraded by an attacker. It does protect you from passive observation of your traffic, but not from active attackers. But the key thing it did do was it started the ball rolling on experimentation for encrypted transports between recursives and authoritatives, because there was a mechanism that was standardized that you could try to do. I'll just touch very briefly on why was it so hard to get this effort off the ground. And I'm not going to cover everything on this slide, but the key technical crux that blocked this development was that delegations are not signed, and neither is glue. Therefore, a recursive cannot, by querying a parent with DNS as it is today, obtain secure credentials just from querying the parent, because the only signed record there is the DS record. So that really was a flaw, not only in the progression of this, but people recognise this as a general flaw in the current delegation mechanism for DNS. So what other mechanisms were looked at the time. So my table here is showing the rows are the three kinds of models that were proposed, and the columns are whether you propose to attach the encrypted transport to the name server or to the zone, because both things are actually possible. So one thing that was looked at was solution one, the new parent-side RR. The second type of solution was a parent-side hack. And the third solution was a child-side RR. Now, I'm not going to drill into these details because they were discussed extensively in the working group. What I will just touch on is why neither of them progressed. So row one is basically putting new records in a parent zone, which requires touching the full ecosystem. And at the time, this was deemed impractical. So it means updates to EPP, possibly updates to ICANN if you want to put this in the root zone. It was a decade-long project. Nobody had quite the appetite for it at the time. Row two here was the option of doing a parent-side hack. And this was fun because we got all sorts of like innovative, interesting solutions to overload the NS, the name server name, like DNS Cryptid, to overload DS records, a few other things. But ultimately, these were all deemed either too slow, too hacky, or too risky. And none of these got consensus. The third row here is to put something in the child side. And while this technically works, it was deemed suboptimal and just not worth putting effort into at the time, because if you want to get a secure record here, the child has to be signed. It can be very slow because it adds round trips, it can be leaky, and it can potentially have a knock-on effect to all zones if you do this at the name server level. So again, there was no consensus and no appetite for any of those solutions. Now things have shifted a bit in the interim, as you can imagine, and what I want to point out here is that the solution 1B is essentially the problem that DELEG is now trying to solve. It is a brand new delegation model so that we can do new things in the DNS and evolve. And the failure of the dprive effort was actually one of the major factors in dprive forming and gaining traction and being seen as something worthwhile to do in the DNS. I'll briefly mention that option 3A here is the subject of a very recent internet draft, started in dprive, has now hopped over into DNS op, around some opportunistic transport signaling, and I'll mention this more in a later slide. So what basically happened, what is the DNS initiative and why is it happening now? Well, we had all that history of people really wanting to do encryption, recursive to authoritative, but there being no clear path to do it because of the technical issues with standardizing it. And what was happening was, over particularly the late 2004 and 2025, there was lots of talk about various parties really wanting to deploy something and wanting to do it now, because there'd been a bit of a lull, I guess, in enthusiasm, and then DELEG was formed and people could see that DELEG was going to provide a solution, but it wasn't going to be short term. I mean, we can all have a sweepstake on when we think DELEG will actually deliver stuff, and that's everything between 6 months to 20 years, depending on who you ask and how you think things are going. And I think given that realization, people really started to think, okay, what can we do short term? We can't wait. We don't want to wait another decade to do this. What can we do short term? And clusters of operators or individual operators had started initiatives to try and find an alternative here. And so the concern was that there was really a fragmentation of effort, and we were beginning to hear about duplication of effort, and the real fear moving forward is a lack of interoperability in the solutions that emerge because you're not working off something that's standardized. So as Andrew mentioned, what we did was we managed to set up a side meeting at IETF 123 in Madrid. And the idea was to get people interested in this in a room together, talking about things and sharing what they've been up to. So this, I think, was a very constructive and very interesting meeting. We had about 50 people in the room. We had about the same again remote. If you're interested in reading the detailed minutes, they're available on the dnsprivacy.org website. If you go there and look in the left-hand column, there's now a section on the ADoT deployment with all of this background and a link to the minutes from that meeting. And so what I'm going to do is just go over some of the outcomes of that meeting and observations. One is that people are currently seeing single high digit encrypted probing traffic arriving at authoritatives today. We think most of that is from Google, and I'll touch on that on the next slide. But there is encrypted traffic out there. There was discussion about transports, because obviously we have multiple options in the DNS for transports these days. The prevailing wisdom is that people are currently experimenting with DNS over TLS because they have the most experience with that in terms of stub to recursive. People are very interested in doing DOQ and mainly expect to migrate to that as a longer term solution. But there is still a feeling that the experience with QUIC in the DNS world is a bit immature, that some of the implementations aren't mature, that some of the libraries that are used aren't mature or aren't well understood. So something that was identified in the meeting is that people want to do a lot more work with QUIC and understand it and get data on it and see it in direct comparison to DOT. What there isn't is any appetite to do DOH in this context. And that makes sense because you don't get any of the benefits with DOH recursive to authoritative that you do stub to recursive. And in fact, it's just more overhead with no benefit. So to my understanding, nobody is interested in doing DO in this context. So as we all know, naming things is hard. So we've also started using the acronym DOX because it seems like both DOT and DOQ are going to be around for a while in this context. So DOX or ADoX is, you often see that used to refer to either ADoT or ADoQ. There were some implementers were there as well, and there were some updates on implementation status. So in terms of open source software on the authoritative side, NSD does DOT, Bind does DOT. Not authoritative actually does both DOT and DOQ, which is why it has the asterisk, and so does DNS dist. So though there's a fair amount available on the authoritative side. Today, the recursive side is not catered for so well, partly because the lack of a standardized mechanism for the discovery of the credentials. What we do have today is that Power DNS and the authors of that were involved in developing and authoring early versions of the probing draft. They have an experimental implementation of the probing draft, and I've just noticed in the chat I possibly got the RFC number of that wrong. Thanks for correcting that back. But they have an implementation of that is available, that is being used by some people. I've listed not recursive here, and they do DNS over TLS upstream, but they have an implementation that predates the specification of that probing draft, and they actually worked on their own auto discovery mechanism, which keyed off certain patterns in the name server name, which hasn't progressed as a standard, but the point is it wouldn't be a huge shift to update that implementation to one that worked on probing or some other mechanism. And there has been early work on Unbound. They did some work at the hackathon 2 or 3 IETFs ago, and that is still ongoing, and Unbound are interested in it, but they don't have anything that's available yet. So the other things that came out, which were the more interesting things, were around the activity of operators. So BRoot, in terms of authoritative operators, BRoot have been operating a experimental DNS over TLS service for, I think, 2 years now, and they see small single digits of encrypted traffic there, which is probably which is probing traffic as far as they know. Facebook weren't at the meeting, but they were involved actually as early as 2018 in doing some very early experiments with Cloudflare to share private keys and do recursive to authoritative encrypted transport. And there have been various studies scanning well-known authoritatives, and Facebook do have they do answer on port 853 on many of their authoritatives today. DESEC actually announced on various mailing lists that they do DNS over TLS and DNS over QUIC on their authoritative hostings. So they're offering that to their customers as well. And again, the results of the scanning showed that CDN77 and I think there were 4 or 5 small TLDs are also listening on port 853. Although none of these are publishing credentials because there's no mechanism, but they are actually listening. What's a lot more interesting, and which is still very much work in progress and has continued from the meeting. So PCH are very interested in deploying this and are actively looking at solutions. IBM NS1 are also actively working on an internal prototype. And so they want to encrypt the traffic internally from their own recursive to their authoritatives. And they want to open this up to public experimentation. They're still working on improving performance because, as you would naturally expect, they're finding a performance hit from switching from UDP to DOT, and they're just doing DOT at the moment. And Cloudflare are in the room and are still talking to lots of people. They still haven't done anything public about experimentation, but they are very open to this. And because they have a CDN infrastructure, just as they were able to with stub to recursive, this is a relatively minor change to their infrastructure to turn this on for authoritives that they host. On the recursive side, Google are an interesting player. As I mentioned, they do probing today and have been doing it for a couple of years. And they published an article, I think 18 months ago, where they claimed that 5% of their egress traffic from public DNS was encrypted. And they can't share specifics, but it's a relatively good guess to think a lot of this is going to Facebook, if Facebook are listening on port 853. Quad9 are also recent players in this field. Literally just after the meeting, they also enabled probing using an experimental implementation of probing. So Quad9 are also there. I don't yet have the latest statistics to see what change that made to the traffic received at authoritatives, but I'm hoping to have that for the future meetings. Let's Encrypt were also in the room, and they are very interesting in terms of their input into this because they are in fact putting a lot of investment into the development of a brand new recursive resolver called Hickory, which they are writing from scratch in Rust. And one of the things they want to do with Hickory is implement encrypted transports upstream to authoritatives early and start using that as soon as they start using Hickory. And they have actually been talking to a number of authoritative hosters about finding a way to do strict without standards being necessary. And at the moment, their proposal is that they have a GitHub repo where interested parties are willing to publish credentials. And Let's Encrypt will use those credentials for the authoritatives, and Let's Encrypt have a stated goal that if those credentials are available, they will use an encrypted transport, and if they can't connect with the encrypted transport, they will actually hard fail. They will not fall back to clear text. So that's quite a strong statement about their belief in the need for encrypted transports. But I think it's also a challenge to authoritative operators being willing to participate in that, because there's obviously implications for their service if they then can't have fully available DNS over TLS. So I think there's a lot of, I think that's something that may or may not happen, but there's a lot of interest and back and my knowledge is there's still a lot of interest and back and forth around that proposition since the meeting. Some of the other players who have said that they would be interested in picking this up are DNS for EU. So they already offer all the encrypted transports, as many of the big open resolvers do. And they have said they would be open to doing this to authoritatives. They currently are reliant on the not resolver implementation, and because that doesn't have a probing implementation yet, they're not able to roll it out. But again, there's ongoing discussions around whether that's something that could happen in the future. So a sort of general summary or takeaway from the meeting and the ongoing discussions are that there is interest, and that there are trusted parties that are now being more connected to do this, still in an experimental way. There are still obvious performance concerns, particularly because for an authoritative, there's a bit of a big bang proposition, which is that it's hard to roll this out incrementally, because once you open a port and once people start using it, then it's a service that's there. And if there are problems with it, you probably have to take it offline. So there are thoughts around that moving forward. There are thoughts around the chicken and egg problem, and hopefully the fact that we've got people talking is going some way towards solving that, because we need more recursives to be probing to convince authoritatives that it's worth opening up port 853 and getting involved in this. And as I mentioned, people really want more data on DOQ before they think about enabling that. So we're very hopeful that this collaboration will also initially get us data on DOT at scale, and then move towards DoC data that people can then pick up on and move forward with. There was also an interesting discussion in the meeting around illustrating the business case for the wider community. There's certainly input at this point in ADoT, ADoQ from the usual suspects, you would think. So there are certain CCLDs who are interested in this because they may have regulatory concerns around privacy or drivers for it. There are GTLD owners who want to differentiate themselves by being able to offer privacy, and banks and governments also. So not dissimilar from the kind of people who are early adopters from DNSSEC. But there's also some good discussion there, which is also ongoing, around how do we bring the business case up to persuade the wider community that this is a step in the right direction, and it has value for them as owners, as zone owners, and also zone operators. So this was mentioned in that meeting, and this is again more ongoing work. So I'll just spin back to it was the option 3A in what can we do in the interim until DELEG delivers something. And this has been written up as a draft by Johan Stenson from NetNod. And he is describing this as opportunistic transport signaling. So it doesn't solve the strict problem, and it is still opportunistic, but it is a specific transport signaling mechanism as opposed to the blind probing, which is what's standardized at the moment. So the idea here is that, so he's described it as there being three pieces of information, three factors that need to be met for this signaling to be sent by an authoritative. So you have an authoritative server, which is about to provide an authoritative response, not a referral. That authoritative server has a name which is in the NSRR set it's going to send back. Then it can add a service binding record into the additional section where it explicitly signals which encrypted transports it supports. So an example there, using service binding, the AOPN, for all the transports. This draft is in its very early stages. I fully expect some of the details to change, but it's gaining a bit of traction. Johan talked about it in the DNS Op meeting. It's still opportunistic, but it's not blind. So one of the things that this does let you do is to progress onto doing experiments where the recursive is caching service binding records that record transports advertised by recursives. And what's interesting about that is that one of the expectations from DELEG is, currently at least, is that whatever solution comes from there will likely involve service binding records being published in the parent. And this is essentially publishing a service binding record in the child that would be picked up. For example, if a recursive was doing NS revalidation of the child, it can get this information. It still has the other downsides of some of the early models in that it's leaky and it's slow. But the key thing is it requires no protocol changes. And in fact, the authors have a working prototype today. So this could be rolled out really quickly, again, to increase experience. Some implementers have expressed interest in this, and there's a possibility that there may be a hackathon project on this at IETF 124. So that would be really interesting if that moved forward. Okay, so next steps. As Andrew mentioned, next week is OARC. Johan is presenting there on the transport signalling, and we're very hopeful that that's going to get more traction. We also have at OARC 45 next week a table topic, and these are new. This is a new idea at OARC. At least I don't believe there's been a formal one before. My understanding is it will be the latter half of the lunch break, and there will be specific tables dedicated where people can come and sit down and chew over certain topics and discuss them. And unfortunately, I won't be at OARC, but Back will be there, and he is going to chair this table topic. So if you're interested in that, please reach out to him. So that's going to be a relatively sort of informal catch-up. What's going to be a more formal follow-up is, again, Babak is leading this and will be there in person to chair it at RIPE 91, which is not very far away, I think it's 4 weeks, 5 weeks. We have a raft of meetings coming up. I believe there's OARC and RIPE and ICANN and then IETF. So I expect a lot of movement across those conferences. But at RIPE 91, we have been accepted to do a BOF on the deployment collaboration, where we hope to get lots of updates from interested parties. I don't think we have a date or time for this. I think the BOFs are usually kind of the Thursday evening of RIPE, but it is, thank you, the RIPE starts on the 20th of October, so this might be the 24th. And there'll be remote participation in this BOF, as far as I know. So 2 weeks after that is IETF, where there'll be more discussion and potentially a hackathon project. We have an OARC Mattermost channel, which we used around the time of the first meeting, but has gone quiet. So I'm very much hoping that will pick up again over the next month of back-to-back conferences. And please take a look at the dnsprivacy.org website. It's a little bit out of date at the moment. I have an action to spin over that, but I try and keep updates on there, both on the ADoT page and on the current work as if new implementations are announced or new initiatives, I'll certainly be posting there, and I can also ping anything to Andrew for him to include it in his weekly updates, which would be great if there are any major announcements. But with that's everything I have today. So very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. It just goes to show there's a lot of stuff happening, which is very impressive. And yeah, I think it's 3 weeks till RIPE. So the conferences are coming thick and fast
Yep.
at the moment. Okay. That was a really comprehensive update, but does anyone have any questions? There's not a lot. I think, Sarah, you missed out, but anyone, if you do, put it in the chat, raise your virtual hand or just unmute, whichever is easiest for you. Happy to take any questions if anything springs to mind.
Sarah, since I hadn't really understood the relation, the Johannes transport signaling draft, this was a really good summary of it. Do you think it's it'll be viewed as benign and reasonable from DELEC standpoint, so that if we deployed it widely, it wouldn't cause another wrinkle for DELEC to have a child side piece in there that they have to now be a little bit worried about? I mean, can we do anything in advance to mitigate that if that is a problem?
So I think when Johan very first put out the draft, there was a little bit of pushback around that, but I think subsequently people saw the value on it in terms of getting experimentation that could actually inform DELEG. One of my thinkings around it is that at the moment, the proposal is that the authoritative makes the choice when to send the additional record, the service binding record. But that if recursives don't want to get that because they're concerned about an increase in response size, they can send an eDNS 0 opt-out to say, don't send me a service binding, even if you would like to. One option is that somebody mentioned was you could flip that so that interested recursives could actually request, say, I understand these service binding records, send them to me if you have them. And that might constrain what's going on. Although Johan makes a very good point that this would go back in the authority section, which any recursive that doesn't recognize what to do with that will ignore it. So hopefully, that would mitigate it for recursives that aren't doing it, aren't interested in it. And for the recursives that do it, they are actively wanting to cache it. And whether there would be a difference between caching it from a parent-side query compared to a child-side query, it's not clear to me at the moment. But my understanding is the thought is you will learn enough from this that it's worth doing on that basis, that it gives you access to that technique, and that it could actually make the transition to DELEG easier for those recursives that already have all that code in them. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That sounds like a great thing to work on at the hackathon, at the several hackathons, actually. Yeah.
And I believe that both Willem was interested in doing it in Unbound, and Peter was interested in doing it in DNS Dist, because he thought it wouldn't be a huge amount of work to do it on top of their probing implementation there. So that would be really nice if we had a couple of open source implementations of that people could start playing with.
Nice, thank you.
The hackathon side, there's an OARC, hackathon this coming weekend. Sarah, I don't know if you've heard if anyone's planning to do anything there or not.
Not on this, not on this at that point. The people that I did know were going to be working on DELEG related things, but I may be wrong.
Yeah, which we'll come back to in a short while. But John's put a question in the chat. Has there been any hint of opposition from anyone that's for non-technical reasons? is it causing eyebrows to be raised on the sort of, the surveillance legal intercept community?
So not that I've heard of, because that was something that happened very early on with stub to recursive. But I haven't heard this, and I think what's interesting is that the people, it's a different, to say an attack vector is maybe putting it strongly, but the actors involved in surveilling recursive to authoritative, going over the network or arriving at authoritative's hosting infrastructure, are probably different potentially to those that were worried about stub to recursive, that were really network operators, for example, who were worried about things leaving their network. So not as yet, and I think it would be fascinating to see who made that objection if it did start to arise. That's a great question, though. So.
Anyone else got any burning questions? All right, because if not, I guess there will be an opportunity to ask them at OARC. So this would be hopefully very useful prep for OARC. And given, I mean, what we can do if it's useful, Sarah, given the various events coming up on this slide, maybe we should find some time, perhaps beginning of December, to revisit the topic, if that makes sense, to try and pull the threads together. Okay, so what
I think I'd say, yeah, let's, after IETF, I think we'll have a much more interesting picture. That would be a good point to reconvene. Okay,
I'll maybe pencil something in. We can compare diaries, but I think so beginning of December, to give a chance for the dust to settle, people to gather their thoughts a bit, because
people get their breath back after the conference season.
Yeah, exactly. Do a bit of follow-up. Okay. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anyone else with a hand raised or anything in the chat. So I think it was incredibly comprehensive. So probably you had a chance to go into a bit more depth than you'll have time for at OARC.
Yes, I think that's going to be a more, I'm hoping that that's more a direct connection between operators and implementers on what they've been doing more recently. Because I know there were connections made at IETF that people are still following up on. So
yeah, I was going to say it's actually almost like speed dating, sort of in Madrid, didn't it? In terms of people suddenly found out others were doing similar stuff, and hopefully had some useful conversations post.
Exactly. Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Well, look, let's pause there. That's brilliant. Are you able to share your slides, and so I can sort of post them
yes, of course. Yeah,
as well. Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, thank you. That was incredibly useful and really sets the scene well for the OARC session. All right, let me move on just briefly. We'll make this fairly rapid to make sure we finish in a timely fashion. So let me reshare my screen momentarily, and as always, I just, for those of you who are new to the call, I just highlight some of the news headlines which are also contained in their sort of weekly headlines email, which if you want that, just ping me an email, I'll add you to the mailing list. But and I run through just 2 or 3 of these. I'm not going to go through them all because we don't have time. There's an interesting piece from Alexander Garcia Tobar, just reflect on the use of, as it says on the side, DNS as a strategic asset, and just highlighting the various sort of DNS-based protocols that can help in terms of source of, I can't remember if it says truth on there, source of truth, source of trust, and the role it can play in zero trust environments. And as you can see, it talks about DNSSEC, DMARC, and DANE, amongst other things. So I thought it was an interesting read over the weekend. And also a piece from Arlen Kokelman, who's a recent master's student who's sort of done some testing work, I think with others, on post-quantum cryptography, trying to drop it in as a replacement for classical algorithms in DNSSEC. And it sort of describes both the sort of the test methodology itself, some of the findings, and various sort of observations for the future. So quite sort of practical. I know there've been sort of various presentations and pieces on this topic quite recently, including the last RIPE meeting. There was quite an interesting presentation there, but yeah, this seemed to take a different angle. So I thought that was useful just to highlight. Other stuff, yeah, well, irritatingly, this is not DNS related. Well, it is only tangentially. ISOC, in my view, continues to do a really poor job with making, as you can see, my words, assertions with little or no substance and certainly not much evidence, where there could be problems that cause internet fragmentation, mainly by putting up straw men of their own creation in order to say why they would be bad, even though there's no evidence that they might happen. And it uses DNS for EU as an example of that. Anyway, I was irritated, so I put some words to say why. I think they could do better than that, and they ought to really look at what's driving some of the potential fragmentation risks, which in my view are harm related, and how to defend against that. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. Just for fun, according to Motley Fool, I haven't checked this. This is not advice, but I think it was suggesting that VeriSign was outperforming NVIDIA. Who knew? Kudos to VeriSign, if that's the case. There's a really good stuff from AdGuard. Anyone's thinking of going to the forthcoming Ad Filtering Dev Summit in Cyprus, there's a whole load of stuff, advice on where to go, where to stay, etc. Really impressive on that, sort of really raises the bar. And then finally, ICANN have confirmed that there's going to be an Africa engagement forum as well as a DNS forum back-to-back in Ghana towards the end of this year, 9th and 10th of December. And there's some more information on that for anyone that is interested in taking part. There's loads of other stuff that caught my eye that's definitely not DNS related, which you might want to peruse. There's a few themes that came out of that, certainly on the second slide. A few things AI related, as you can see, a few things that were also just over the screen quantum related, so a few different themes on there. Quite a lot of stuff non-DNS related this week. So I split it over 3 slides. That's probably the most I've ever put out that's not DNS related, but lots of interesting stuff happening at the moment, which you might want to scan. Just briefly, deadlines coming up. The RIPE, since we're talking about RIPE just now, the RIPE program is confirmed actually today. Who knew? So, which is presumably why or how Babak was able to confirm the timing for the BOF at RIPE 91. So the whole program should be published now. I haven't had a chance to look clearly, otherwise I would have been better informed on that. Also, just a reminder, if you're planning to respond to Centre's call for proposals around a web crawler, then that deadline's tomorrow to get your responses in. I don't think that's been extended. The other one I'll just highlight, because there was an email out over the weekend from the IETF non-com. They were low on nominations for a few of the leadership vacancies, so they've extended the deadline to the 13th of October, so extended by 2 weeks. So give some thought to who you might want to nominate. You can self-nominate, nominate other people for consideration from there's a whole raft of roles for that, so I just thought I would highlight that. And then there's other things coming up, but with more time, so we won't talk about those because we've only got 5 minutes. Lots of events, as was mentioned. So you've got LACNIC 44 and LACNOG in El Salvador at the same time as OARC 45 in Stockholm, at the same time as an IAB W3C workshop on age-based restrictions on content access in London. I will be at the latter of those, so sadly won't be at OARC, which is frustrating, but can't be in sort of multiple places at once. But I think OARC should be really good. I'm sure LACNet 44 will be, but maybe some of you will also be at the IAB W3C session as well. And then, as you can see, a bit later on in the month, 20th to 24th, you've got RIPE 91, and then 2 weeks after that, IETF 124 with ICANN 84 sandwiched literally in between those two. So you could go from Bucharest to Dublin to Montreal if you so desired. The one thing I just wanted to briefly just draw your attention, I did send an email out about this on Ralph's behalf, which is next Monday, the 6th of October, there's a DEDEG side meeting in Stockholm. So if you're going to OARC 45, which is Tuesday and Wednesday, on the Monday afternoon from 1 p.m. local time, this is going to be an informal DEDEG side meeting. We did one of those in Charlotte not that long ago, and also in Atlanta after that. So continuing that fine tradition. So Petter and Ralph and others will be there. So if you want to catch up what's happening with DEDEG, as that's been mentioned on this call, then that would be an excellent opportunity to do that if you're in Stockholm. Anyway, it's at the Swedish Internet Foundation offices in Stockholm. The details are on the slide. So if you can do that, I'm sure Ralph, Petter and others will be pleased to see you. Finally, from me, next week we'll be talking about IoT DNS security and privacy guidelines. There's an internet draft published by Jim Mosley of Infoblox and Friends from I think it's UCL, or maybe Imperial, one of the two London colleges, and also Institute in France as well. So Jim and I think a few others will be on the call talking about that. And then we'll the week after, we'll maybe just do a bit of feedback from the IEBW3 workshop and OARC 45 highlights. Other things coming after that, and then I'll probably maybe on the 8th of December, perhaps might be, because it's well after IETF 124. We'll see if it works for Sara. Perhaps do another session on ADoT and ADoQ, or ADoX, as it's now called, just to sort of pull together the threads from everything that would have happened over those few weeks. So I hope that was useful. We've got roughly 60 seconds left, so let me stop sharing. Thank you to our sponsors, DNSOR. Does anyone have anything else you want to mention? And if so, you've got about a bit less than 60 seconds to do so, or put it in the chat and I'll add it to the meeting notes if that's useful. No one's jumping in, so it looks possibly not. In which case, let's draw a line there. Sara, thank you. Sorry, Josh, were you trying to come in, or
No,
you just?
that was good. Just how do we sign up for the sheep herding next year?
There's a whole discussion about how you can become a freeman of the City of London. I will post something to that effect. But yeah, I would recommend it as an experience it's worth doing to at least once, so you can say that you have. Yeah. On that note, then. Thank you. Hope that was useful, everyone. Have a great week, and catch up next week. We can learn about IoT DNS security from Jim and friends. Thanks, Sara, and enjoy your week, everyone. Bye all.